Welcome to my channel.
The air in Loch Dhu was thick with the scent of peat smoke and damp wool, a smell Hamish Macbeth usually found comforting. Today, however, it was being ruthlessly assaulted by the smell of expensive Italian exhaust fumes. Hamish sat on the bench outside the police station, his long, lanky frame folded like a deck chair. He was ostensibly monitoring the village traffic, a task that mostly involved letting his dog, Lugs, sniff the occasional passing sheep. In reality, Hamish was trying to ignore the persistent ringing of the telephone inside. He knew it would be Detective Chief Inspector Blair from Strathbane, likely calling to yell at him about a missing paperwork file, or to demand why the crime rate in Loch Dhu was suspiciously low. "He'll give up eventually," Hamish murmured to Lugs, who let out a sympathetic woof. The peace was shattered by a screech of tyres. A car the colour of a fresh wound, a Ferrari, thundered down the narrow waterfront road, sending a spray of salt water over Mrs. Wellington's prize hydrangeas. It skidded to a halt in front of the Loch Dhu Hotel. Out stepped Mr. Julian Vane, a man who looked like he had been manufactured in a factory that specialised in arrogance. He was wearing a beige linen suit entirely inappropriate for a Sutherland October, and sunglasses that cost more than Hamish's annual salary. Vane had bought the old McCrae estate on the hill, renaming it the Vane Sanctuary, a move that had immediately soured his relationship with the locals, who still called it the Damp Heap. "You there, policeman!" Vane shouted, waving a manicured hand toward Hamish. "There are sheep on the road up by my gates. Do something about it. They're a menace to my suspension." Hamish stood up slowly, very slowly, his hazel eyes clouded with a look of vacant helpfulness.
"Ah, the sheep, sir. Yes, they have a terrible habit of standing where they've stood for the last 400 years. It's a lack of education, I suppose."
"Don't be glib with me, Macbeth," Vane snapped, his English accent cutting through the soft Highland air like a serrated knife. "I pay enough in taxes to have this village paved in gold. The least you can do is clear the livestock." Hamish sighed, adjusted his salt and pepper uniform hat, and watched as Vane stormed into the hotel to complain about the lack of soy milk. "He's a man looking for a tragedy," Hamish whispered to the empty street. The tragedy, as it happened, wouldn't keep him waiting long. The following morning the Sutherland mist clung to the peaks of the Suilven like a wet woolen blanket, refusing to lift even as the clock in the village square struck 9. Hamish Macbeth was in his kitchen, the small room filled with the rich, earthy aroma of his first pot of coffee. Lugs sat by the stove, his ears twitching at the sound of the wind whistling through the cracks in the door. Hamish had been planning a quiet day of patrolling the coastal path, which was his preferred euphemism for sitting on a rock and watching the Atlantic rollers come in, perhaps with a cheeky fishing line tucked into his pocket. He had just poured his first mug when the peace was shattered by a frantic thumping at the door. He opened it to find Archie MacLean, the local shepherd, looking as pale as a ghost and smelling strongly of damp wool and panic. Archie's breath came in ragged gasps, and he clutched his crook so tightly his knuckles were white. "It's the Sassenach, Hamish," Archie stammered, pointing a shaking finger toward the mist-shrouded hills that led up to the McCrae estate. "Up by the standing stones. It's no right. He's no right at all." Hamish didn't need to ask who the Sassenach was. There was only one man in Loch Dhu who had managed to offend every soul in the parish within 48 hours of arrival. He grabbed his coat and followed Archie out into the drizzle, his long legs eating up the distance, while Lugs trotted faithfully at his heels. They climbed the steep, boggy track where Julian Vane's Ferrari had struggled the day before. The higher they went, the more the wind howled, whipping the heather into a frenzy. When they reached the circle of ancient standing stones that sat on the ridge overlooking the loch, Hamish stopped dead. Julian Vane was there, but he was no longer complaining about sheep or taxes. He was slumped against the tallest of the prehistoric monoliths, his expensive linen suit soaked through and stained with the dark, peaty mud of the Highlands. He looked smaller in death, his arrogance stripped away by the sheer indifference of the landscape. But it was the manner of his death that made Hamish's skin crawl with a cold, professional curiosity. Julian Vane had been tied to the stone with a length of rough, oily baling twine. the kind every farmer in the district kept in their pockets. A sprig of purple heather had been shoved into the pocket of his blazer, and his mouth was stuffed with a handful of raw oats. His designer sunglasses lay shattered at his feet, one lens reflecting the grey sky like a dead eye. There was no obvious sign of a struggle, no blood on the heather, just the man fixed to a piece of history like a grotesque museum exhibit. "He looks like a harvest doll, Hamish," Archie whispered, crossing himself, "like one of the old offerings." Hamish knelt beside the body, his joints protesting in the damp air. He didn't touch anything. He knew the rules of the Strathbane forensic teams, even if he found their methods tedious. He looked at the knots in the twine, clove hitches expertly tied, the work of someone used to securing loads or livestock. He looked at the oats in Vane's mouth. It was a bizarre, humiliating end for a man who had prided himself on his sophistication. It wasn't just a murder. It was a message. It was a local joke told in the darkest possible way. "Go down to the hotel, Archie," Hamish said softly, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Tell Mrs. Curry to phone the station. Tell them I need a doctor and tell them to put through a call to Strathbane. I'll stay here with him." As Archie scrambled back down the hill, Hamish sat on a low rock a few yards away from the body. He pulled his collar up against the rain and took out a small notebook, though he didn't write anything yet. He simply watched. He watched the way the mist moved through the stones, and he thought about the dinner Julian Vane had eaten at the hotel the night before. Mrs. Curry had mentioned he'd sent back the venison twice, claiming it was overly gamey, a remark that had sent the cook into a silent, knife-sharpening rage. Hamish noted the position of Vane's feet. They were pointed toward the village, as if he were being forced to look at the people he had spent his last days insulting. The deceptive laziness that his superiors so often complained about took over. Hamish wasn't rushing to bag evidence or measure footprints. He was soaking in the atmosphere of the crime. He noticed that while the grass around the stones was trampled, there were two distinct sets of footprints leading away toward the wooded glen, not the main path. One set was heavy, likely a man's boot, but the other was lighter, more delicate, skipping over the boggy patches. Luggs gave a low growl, his hackles rising. Hamish looked up. Far below he could hear a faint, discordant wail of a police siren. It was too fast, too loud, and entirely too aggressive for the winding roads of the Highlands. That would be DCI Blair, no doubt. The man would arrive like a whirlwind, trampling over the very clues Hamish was currently memorizing, and he would likely spend the first hour screaming about why Hamish hadn't set up a perimeter tape in the middle of a gale-force wind. Hamish looked back at Vane. The man's face, usually twisted in a sneer, was now frozen in an expression of mild surprise. It was as if, at the very end, he had realized that his money and his Ferrari meant absolutely nothing to the cold, hard stone and the ancient grudges of the North. Hamish felt a pang of something that wasn't quite pity, more like a weary recognition of human folly. "You should have stayed in London, Mr. Vane," Hamish murmured. "The air up here is a bit too thin for your likes, and the neighbours have very long memories." The sirens grew louder, echoing off the valley walls. The peace of Loch Dhu was officially over. Within minutes, the hilltop would be crawling with men in white suits and detectives in cheap raincoats, all of them looking for DNA and fingerprints while ignoring the fact that the victim had been stuffed with oats in a village where everyone knew exactly whose granary had been broken into last week. Hamish stood up, brushing the damp peat from his trousers. He needed to look suitably gormless before Blair arrived. He wiped the keen elegance from his eyes, replaced it with a look of vague rural confusion, and waited for the circus to begin. The aggressive wail of the sirens eventually gave way to the slamming of car doors and the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots marching through the saturated peat. DCI Blair appeared over the ridge first, his face already a shade of crimson that rivaled Julian Vane's Ferrari. He was panting heavily, his cheap suit trousers darkened to the knees by the boggy ascent, and his tie was whipped over his shoulder by the Highland wind. Behind him trailed Jimmy Anderson, looking hungover and miserable, and a small army of technicians lugging heavy cases of equipment. Blair took one look at the body tied to the standing stone, and then turned his fury toward Hamish, who was standing a respectful distance away, looking as if he were trying to remember how to tie his own shoelaces. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, his voice echoing off the ancient monoliths. Why in the name of God is there no tape? Why is the area not secured? I've seen better crime scene management from a pack of stray dogs. He stomped toward Hamish, his breath smelling of stale cigarettes and the greasy breakfast he'd clearly bolted down in Strathbane. Look at you, standing there like a garden gnome while a taxpayer is tied to a rock like a side of beef. Have you touched anything? Have you moved the body? If you've contaminated this scene, I'll have you directing traffic in a Shetland blizzard for the rest of your miserable career. Hamish adjusted his hat with a slow, deliberate movement, his expression one of pained sincerity. I haven't touched a thing, sir. I thought it best to wait for the experts from the city. The wind is a bit fierce, you see, and I didn't want the tape blowing away into the loch and bothering the salmon. They're very sensitive to plastic, so they say. Blair let out a sound like a boiling kettle. Salmon! You're worried about fish? We have a high-profile murder, you useless Highland peasant. This man was Julian Vane. Do you have any idea who he knew? He had friends in the Home Office. He had more money than the Central Bank of Scotland. And here he is, tied up like a pagan sacrifice because you were too busy daydreaming about your dinner to keep an eye on your own village. Blair turned his back on Hamish, dismissing him with a wave of his hand as he barked orders at the forensic team. Get the photos. I want every knot examined. And Anderson, start a log. I want to know exactly who has been on this hill since sunrise. Jimmy Anderson sighed, pulling out a damp notebook and looking at Hamish with a flick of weary sympathy. Tough luck, Hamish. He's been in a foul mood since we left the station. Lost 50 quid on the horses yesterday. He lowered his voice, nodding toward the body. Quite a sight, isn't it? The oats are a bit of a flourish. Very traditional. It's almost like the killer wanted to make sure we knew it was a local job. Local? Blair snapped, having a heard. Don't be an idiot, Anderson. This is clearly the work of professional kidnappers. It went wrong, or they were making a political statement. You don't get oats and heather from a common village thief. It's a distraction, a theatrical ruse to throw us off the scent of an organized gang. He pointed a thick, sausage-like finger at the village below. I want a list of every disgruntled local who ever had a crossword with Van. Which, from what I hear, is every single one of them. We'll start with that shepherd who found the body. McLean, wasn't it? He looked guilty as sin when he passed us on the road, probably had a dispute over grazing rights. It's always sheep with these people. Hamish stood quietly, leaning slightly against a stone that wasn't currently occupied by a corpse. He watched as the forensic team began their meticulous, cold-blooded work. They were focused on the baling twine and the shattered sunglasses, scraping samples into plastic bags and clicking away with their high-end cameras. None of them noticed what Hamish had seen earlier, the specific way the heather sprig had been tucked into the pocket, not haphazardly, but with a certain delicate precision, as if by someone who cared about the aesthetics of the insult. Nor did they look at the two sets of footprints leading toward the glen, which were already beginning to fill with rainwater and vanish into the peat. "I'll just be getting out of your way then, sir," Hamish said, his voice a masterclass in feigned subservience. "Since you've got the professionals here, I'm sure I'd only be tripping over the wires. I'll head down and maybe check the station for that paperwork you mentioned." "Yes, get out," Blair barked without looking up. "Go and hide in your little house and try not to get in the way of a real investigation. If I need someone to count sheep or find a lost cat, I'll call you. Until then, stay away from my suspects." Hamish whistled softly for lugs and began the descent. He didn't head straight for the police station, however. As soon as he was out of Blair's line of sight, he veered off the main track, his boots finding the firmer ground beneath, the heather, with the ease of a man who knew every inch of the moor. He stopped by a small, gorse-choked hollow and looked back up at the ridge. The hilltop was now a frantic hive of neon jackets and flashing strobes, a bright, noisy intrusion on the ancient silence of the Highlands. Blair was currently shouting at a technician who had tripped over a tripod, his face glowing like a beacon in the grey light. Hamish knew the DCI's routine. Blair would bully the locals, arrest the most convenient person, likely poor Archie McLean, and spend the next 3 days demanding a confession, while the actual killer sat at home having a nice cup of tea. It was a predictable, clumsy dance, and it gave Hamish exactly what he needed: time. He needed to find out who Vane had spoken to in his final hours, and more importantly, Wah! O had remained silent. His stomach gave a loud, treacherous rumble, reminding him that he had abandoned his coffee and breakfast for a hilltop full of death and insults. He looked toward the village, where the chimneys of the Lochdu Hotel were sending up plumes of sweet-smelling peat smoke. Mrs. Curry would have the range going, and there would be fresh scones, and perhaps a bit of information that hadn't yet been processed into a plastic evidence bag. As he walked, Hamish's mind worked with a sharp, cold clarity that would have terrified Blair. He thought of the oats, the twine, and the 2 sets of prints. He thought of Vane's linen suit and the shattered glasses. The circus had arrived in Lochdu, but Hamish Macbeth was already moving toward the back of the tent to see who was pulling the strings. The damp chill of the moor seemed to follow Hamish as he descended into the village, but the atmosphere in Lochdu had changed. The arrival of the Strathbane police had acted like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples of anxiety through the small community. People were peeking from behind lace curtains, and the usual clusters of men outside the post office had dispersed, replaced by a wary, watchful silence. Hamish, however, didn't look like a man on an investigation, with lugs trotting at his side and his hands deep in his pockets. He looked like a man who had been thoroughly scolded and was now looking for a quiet place to hide from his boss. He made his way to the back door of the Lochdu Hotel, knowing that the front entrance would be blocked by Blair's idling cruisers and bustling constables. The kitchen was a sanctuary of warmth, smelling of baking bread and frying bacon. Mrs. Curry, the proprietor, was standing by the large iron range, her face set in a grim mask of disapproval. She didn't look up as he entered, but she slid a plate of buttered toast and a thick rasher of bacon onto the scrubbed wooden table. "Blair's been in the lobby for all of 10 minutes, and he's already called my night porter a substandard witness, and complained that the coffee is too weak," she said, her voice tight with indignation. "He's a rude man, Hamish. A very rude man." Hamish sat down and began to eat with a slow, appreciative focus. "He's a busy man, Mrs. Curry. He has to find a murderer before lunch, or his blood pressure will never recover. He's convinced it's a gang of international kidnappers." Mrs. Curry snorted, finally turning to look at him. "Kidnappers? In Lochdu?" "The only thing kidnapped in this village in the last 10 years was the minister's prize marrow, and we all know that was the work of the Patel boys. No, that Vane man was a nuisance, but he wasn't worth the effort of a gang." Hamish chewed thoughtfully, leaning back in his chair. "He was a difficult guest, I hear. You mentioned the venison last night. Was there anyone else he upset? Besides the entire population of the Highlands, I mean." Mrs. Curry leaned over the tab, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He had a visitor yesterday afternoon. Not a local, a woman, very tall, very blonde, and wearing enough perfume to choke a stag. They had a row in the library that could be heard through the oak doors. She was demanding something, money or papers, I couldn't quite tell, and he told her to go back to the gutter she crawled out of." Hamish's hazel eyes sharpened, though he kept his posture relaxed. "And did this lady have a name, registered as a Mrs. Montgomery?" "Though she didn't look like any Montgomery I've ever met. She left in a huff around 5 o'clock, driving a silver Mercedes that looked nearly as ridiculous as that Ferrari. But it wasn't just her, Hamish. There was someone else. Last night, after the bar closed, I saw Julian Vane walking out toward the glen. He wasn't alone. He was with someone in a dark waterproof, someone shorter than him. I thought it was just one of the locals giving him a piece of their mind, but they seemed familiar with each other." Hamish finished his toast, his mind sorting through the information. A blonde woman with a grudge and a mysterious midnight companion in a waterproof. It was more than Blair would ever get out of Mrs. Curry, mostly because Blair would start by accusing her of harbouring criminals. Hamish thanked her for the food, patted lugs, and made his way back out into the drizzle. His next stop was the village post office. Mrs. Emma Borland, the postmistress, was the Uno, official curator of Lochdu's secrets. She knew who owed money to the electricity board, who was receiving letters from lawyers in London, and who had been ordering suspicious amounts of baling twine from the catalogue. "It's a terrible business, Hamish," she said as he stepped inside, her spectacles glinting with excitement. "A murder at the Stones. It's like something out of those dreadful paperbacks. I told Mr. Borland that bringing those English city types here would lead to nothing but grief. Did you see the oats? Everyone's talking about the oats. I saw them, Hamish said, leaning against the counter. Very strange. It's almost as if the killer thought Mr. Vane needed a bit of feeding. Or a bit of silencing, Mrs. Borland countered, leaning forward. Did you know he was trying to buy up the fishing rights for the whole loch? He'd sent out notices to the local gillies, telling them their services would no longer be required once he'd turned the water into a private members' club. He was a greedy man, Hamish, and greed in the Highlands is a dangerous thing. Hamish nodded vaguely. Greed is a common enough sin, but tying a man to a stone requires a certain amount of local knowledge. You wouldn't happen to know if any of our neighbours have been particularly handy with their twine lately? Mrs. Borland's eyes shifted. Well, Archie McLean has enough twine to bind the moon, but he hasn't the stomach for killing anything bigger than a sickly lamb. But young Peter... The estate manager Vane fired last week. He was seen up by the glen last night. He was carrying a rucksack and looking very grim indeed. He's a proud lad, and Vane called him a worthless peasant in front of the whole hotel staff. Hamish made a mental note of Peter the manager. It was another thread, but the pattern was still messy. He stepped back out into the mist, the cold air feeling sharper now. He had the gossip, the secrets, and the simmering resentments. He had a blonde woman in a Mercedes and a fired manager with a rucksack, but as he looked up toward the manor house, he realized he was missing the one thing that usually tied his cases together, the social perspective of someone who moved in Julian Vane's circles, but had the sense to see through the veneer. He needed to talk to Priscilla Halberton Smythe. He began the walk toward the Halberton Smythe estate, his mind retracing the two sets of footprints he had seen in the peat, one heavy, one light. The heavy boots could be Peter's or Archie's or any man's in the village, but the light prints, the ones that skipped over the bogs, those didn't belong to a shepherd or a disgruntled worker. They belonged to someone who didn't want to get their shoes dirty, or perhaps someone who knew the ground so well they didn't need to look where they were stepping. As the rain turned into a steady, rhythmic drumbeat against his cap, Hamish Macbeth realized that the murder of Julian Vane wasn't just about grazing rights or fee. Shing clubs. It was a play, and the most important actor had yet to take the stage. The driveway to Tommel Castle was lined with ancient oaks that seemed to groan under the weight of the Atlantic gale, their skeletal branches clawing at the low-hanging clouds. Hamish Macbeth trudged up the gravel path, his boots squelching with every step, feeling very much like a man out of his depth, and yet perfectly in his element. He knew that while the kitchens and post offices of Loch Dhu provided the meat of the village gossip, the bones of a man like Julian Vane were best picked over in the drawing-rooms of the gentry. Luggs, sensing the shift in social standing, trotted with a bit more dignity, though he still paused to investigate a particularly interesting scent on a rhododendron bush. Priscilla Halberton Smythe was in the morning room, a space of faded chintz and silver tea services that always made Hamish feel as though he should be more carefully scrubbed than he ever managed to be. She was as beautiful as ever, her pale blonde hair pulled back in a way that managed to look both casual and impossibly elegant. When she saw Hamish at the door, a small, weary smile touched her lips, a smile that usually sent a painful jolt through Hamish's heart, though today it was tempered by the grim business at hand. "I heard the sirens earlier, Hamish," she said, gesturing for him to sit in a chair that felt far too delicate for his frame, "and I saw the flashing lights up on the ridge. The rumours about Mr. Vane are true. The village is saying he was found at the Standing Stones dressed up like a pagan doll." Hamish took off his hat and rested it on his knee. "It's true enough, Priscilla, tying a man to a rock and stuffing his mouth with oats. It's a bit theatrical, even for Loch Dhu. DCI Blair is currently convinced it's the work of a professional hit squad from London, but I've yet to meet a professional hitman who carries a spare pocketful of porridge." Priscilla poured him a cup of tea, the china clinking softly. "Julian was a dreadful man, Hamish. There's no point in speaking well of the dead when the dead spent their entire lives making others miserable. He was at a dinner party here only last week, and he managed to insult my father's port, the local hunt, and the very concept of Scottish hospitality within 20 minutes. She paused, her gaze drifting to the window where the rain was lashing against the glass. But he was also a man in deep trouble. He wasn't just here to play at being a laird, he was hiding. Hamish leaned forward, his interest piqued. Hiding from what? Mrs. Curry mentioned a woman. a blonde in a silver Mercedes, who came to see him. They had a row in the hotel library. That would be Diane, Priscilla said, a note of distaste in her voice. His business partner, or perhaps his ex-wife, the lines were always blurred with Julian. She called me this morning, frantic. She claims Julian had taken something from their firm, a set of ledgers, I believe, that proved he'd been siphoning off funds for years. He'd come to Lochdu because he thought the isolation would protect him. He didn't realize that in a place like this, everyone sees everything. And did she say where she was last night? Hamish asked. She says she stayed in Inverness, though she has the temperament of a cornered cat. But Hamish, there's something else. You mentioned the oats. Did you know that Julian had filed a formal complaint against the local history society? He wanted the standing stones moved. He called them an eyesore that ruined the view from his master bedroom. He'd even hired contractors to survey the site for demolition. Hamish felt a cold prickle at the back of his neck. The standing stones were more than just rocks to the people of Lochdu. They were a part of the landscape's soul. To move them was an act of sacrilege that went beyond simple property disputes. Who was the head of that society? Old Major McLean, Priscilla replied. He was absolutely livid. He told everyone at the pub that if Vane touched a single stone, he'd find himself becoming a part of the local history sooner than he liked. But the Major is 80 years old, Hamish. He can barely climb the stairs, let alone haul a man up a hill and tie him to a monolith. Hamish nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about the light footprints he'd seen in the bog, the ones that skipped over the heather. They weren't the prints of an 80-year-old man, nor were they the heavy tread of a labourer like Peter, the fired manager. They were the prints of someone agile, someone who knew the terrain, and someone who perhaps felt that Julian Vane's presence was a stain on the land itself. As he sat there, the warmth of the tea finally reaching his bones, Hamish felt the familiar, uncomfortable pull of his feelings for Priscilla. She was helping him, as she often did, providing the social context that he couldn't grasp from the bottom of a pint glass. Yet there was always a distance between them, a gap filled by her station, and his own stubborn refusal to be anything other than the lazy policeman of Lochdu. Blair is going to arrest Archie McLean, Hamish said abruptly, standing up. He's the easy target. He's got the twine, he's got the sheep, and he's got the bad luck to have found the body. I need to find those ledgers, Priscilla. If Vane was hiding them, he wouldn't have kept them at the manor where Diane could find them. He would have tucked them somewhere he thought was beneath his own dignity. Like the police station, Priscilla suggested with a dry smile. Or the hotel, Hamish mused. But Vane didn't trust Mrs. Curry. He thought we were all beneath him. He looked at Luggs, who was waiting patiently by the door. Thank you for the tea, Priscilla, and for the gossip. It's always the best in the county. Be careful, Hamish, she said, her voice softening. Blair is looking for a scapegoat, and if you get in high, sway, he'll be more than happy to make it you. And the person who killed Julian Vane didn't just want him dead, they wanted him humiliated. That's a very specific kind of anger. Hamish stepped out back into the rain, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him. The investigation was moving now, shifting from the blunt trauma of the murder scene into the tangled web of greed and local pride. He had a blonde woman in a silver Mercedes, a fired manager with a grudge, a livid major, and a set of missing ledgers. But as he looked back up toward the mist-shrouded standing stones, he couldn't shake the image of those light-skipping footprints. Someone had led Julian Vane to his death, and they had done it with the grace of a dancer. He began the walk back to the village, his mind already formulating a plan to check the one place in Lochdu that Julian Vane would never have suspected contained a man smarter than himself. He needed to find Peter, the manager, but he also needed to find out who else had been seen near the glen last night. Not a man in a dark waterproof, but someone who moved through the Highland rain as if they were a part of it. The walk back from Tommel Castle was a sodden affair, the rain now settling into a persistent thin drizzle that the Highlanders called helpful because it didn't immediately soak you, but eventually left you damp to the marrow. Hamish Macbeth walked with his chin tucked into his collar, his thoughts revolving around the light, skipping footprints and the missing ledgers Priscilla had mentioned. If Julian Vane had been siphoning money, he wouldn't have left the evidence in his Ferrari or the manor house. Both were too obvious, too vulnerable to a search by the formidable Diane Montgomery. Hamish knew the mind of a city man like Vane. Such men believed that the locals were part of the scenery, as inanimate as the furniture, and just as incapable of curiosity. As he reached the outskirts of the village, the peace was once again violated by the sight of a police van parked haphazardly outside Archie McLean's small stone cottage. DCI Blair was there, standing in the mud and shouting at a white-faced Archie, while Jimmy Anderson looked on with a mixture of boredom and pity. 2 constables were hauling bags of baling twine out of Archie's shed, as if they had discovered a cache of illegal explosives. "I have you now, you old fraud." Blair's voice carried across the damp air. "The twine matches the murder weapon exactly, oily, rough, and used for binding. And look at this. Oats. A half-empty sack of oats in your larder. What was it, McLean? Did he try to move your sheep? Did he insult your border collie? You tied him up like a Christmas ham and left him to rot." Archie was trembling so hard his flat cap was vibrating. "I tell you, Inspector, I used that twine for the fences, and the oats are for the winter mash. I didn't kill the man, I only found him." Hamish approached the scene slowly, his hands deep in his pockets, oaking for all the world like a curious bystander. "Everything all right, sir?" he asked, his voice dripping with feigned innocence. "You seem to have had a very successful morning." Blair spun around, his eyes gleaming with a nasty triumph. "Successful? It's a closed case, Macbeth. While you were off mooching tea from the gentry, I've been doing real police work. The motive is clear, a local dispute over land. The weapon is in those bags. The victim was humiliated with the very products of this man's livelihood. It's open and shut. I'm taking him into Strathbane for formal questioning, and by tonight I'll have a confession." Hamish looked at the bags of twine, and then at Archie. He knew Archie hadn't the strength to haul Vane up that hill, let alone the cold-blooded wit to arrange him so artistically. "It's very impressive, sir," Hamish said softly. "But I noticed something odd about the twine on the body. It was tied with clove hitches, but they were finished with a very specific tuck, the kind they use in the merchant navy. Archie here has never been further than Inverness in his life. He ties his knots like a shepherd, not a sailor." Blair's face went from red to a dangerous shade of purple. "Knots? You're talking to me about knots? I have a forensics lab, Macbeth. I don't need a village idiot's lecture on macrame. Get out of my sight before I arrest you for obstructing an investigation." Hamish watched as they bundled the protesting Archie into the van. He felt a sharp pang of guilt for the old man, but he knew that arguing with Blair in this state was like shouting at a landslide. He waited until the van had roared away, tires spinning in the muck, before he turned toward the small derelict cottage at the edge of the woods. This was where Peter, the fired estate manager, lived. If anyone knew about Vane's secret hiding spots or his midnight visitors, it would be the man who had been paid to look after his interests until a week ago. The cottage was silent. The door was unlocked, a common enough thing in Lochdu, though increasingly rare since the Sassenach invasion. Hamish stepped inside, lugs following with a low, inquisitive whine. The room was sparsely furnished but tidy, except for the table, which was covered in maps of the Macrae estate. Hamish began to poke around, not with the frantic energy of Blair's team, but with a slow, systematic grace. He looked behind the clock, under the loose floorboard by the hearth, and finally in the old bread box. There, tucked inside a greasy paper bag that smelled of fish, he found them, the ledgers. They were leather-bound and filled with columns of figures that made Hamish's head swim. But it wasn't just the ledgers. Tucked into the back cover was a photograph. It showed Julian Vane standing on the deck of a yacht, laughing with his arm around a woman. It wasn't the blonde Diane Montgomery. It was a younger woman, dark-haired and familiar. Hamish squinted at the image. It was Mary, the girl who, walked in the hotel laundry. The one everyone said was a bit of a dreamer, and who spent her weekends hiking the glens. Suddenly, the light, skipping footprints made sense. A local girl who knew the bogs, who moved with the agility of a deer, and who had a reason to know exactly how a sailor tied a knot. Her father had been a fisherman on the west coast for 40 years. Hamish felt a cold weight in his stomach. Peter, the manager, hadn't stolen these ledgers to blackmail Vane. He had hidden them to protect Mary. A floorboard creaked behind him. Hamish didn't turn around immediately. He carefully slid the ledgers back into the bread box. "You should have burned them, Peter," he said quietly. Blair is an idiot, but even an idiot eventually looks in the bread box when he's hungry for a conviction. Peter stood in the doorway, his rucksack still on his shoulders, his face weary and shadowed. He didn't look like a murderer. He looked like a man who was exhausted by the weight of someone else's secrets. "She didn't mean to kill him, Hamish," Peter said, his voice cracking. "He was a beast. He'd promised her the world when they met in London, then treated her like a servant when he got here. Last night he told her he was going to have her father's cottage torn down to make room for a helipad. She just wanted to talk to him, to show him the ledgers, to tell him she knew what he was doing. And the standing stones?" Hamish asked, finally turning to face him. He laughed at her. "Peter," said, a spark of anger lighting his eyes. He stood there by the stones and laughed. He told her she was as archaic and useless as the rocks. He was drunk, Hamish. He tripped. He hit his head on the monolith. She didn't strike him, but when he was down, she snapped. She tied him up. She wanted him to look as ridiculous as he made her feel. She didn't know he was already dying from the fall. Hamish looked at the photograph again. The tragedy was unfolding, but not in the way Blair imagined. There was no international gang, no shepherd's grudge, just a girl who had been pushed too far and a man who had underestimated the land he tried to own. But Hamish knew he couldn't just let it go. The law was the law, even in Loch Dhu. Yet, as he heard the distant sound of Blair's siren returning, likely coming to search Peter's house next, Hamish realized he had a very narrow window to ensure that the right person took the blame for the right reasons. "Go to the hotel, Peter," Hamish commanded. "Find Mary, tell her to stay in the laundry. I'm going to take these ledgers to the station. And Peter, don't mention the knots. Let Blair think what he wants for an hour or two longer." As Peter vanished into the trees, Hamish tucked the ledgers under his arm. He had the motive, he had the evidence, and he had a very clever idea of how to make DCI Blair look like a hero while ensuring the truth didn't destroy an innocent girl's life more than it already had. He just needed to set the trap. The damp weight of the ledgers under his arm felt like a ticking clock as Hamish moved through the fringe of the pine woods, avoiding the main road where Blair's cruiser was likely to come thundering back at any moment. The revelation about Mary, the quiet girl from the laundry, had cast a darker shadow over the morning than even the Highland mist could manage. It wasn't just a murder now, it was a tragedy of the most pathetic kind, the sort born from the collision of a city man's casual cruelty and a local girl's desperate pride. Julian Vane had seen Loch Dhu as a playground or a hiding place, never realizing that the people he treated like the furniture had hearts that could break and tempers that could flare. Hamish reached his own small police station and went straight to the kitchen. He needed to think, and for Hamish, thinking was an activity that required a hot stove and a pot of stew. He set the ledgers on the table and began peeling potatoes with a slow, rhythmic precision, his eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window. Luggs settled under the table, his tail thumping occasionally against the floorboards. The motive was finally clear, but it wasn't the one Blair was bellowing about. It wasn't about land or sheep. It was about the humiliation of a woman who had once been told she was special, only to be discarded like a piece of outdated machinery when the man's whims changed. The ledgers told the story of Vaney's greed. Millions of pounds shifted from London accounts into offshore shelters, but the photograph told the story of his death. Mary hadn't gone to the standing stones to kill him, she had gone to confront him, to use the evidence Peter had secured for her as a shield against the destruction of her father's home. The fall had been an accident, a drunken stumble in the dark, but the tying of the body had been a ritual of reclaiming power. The oats, the heather, the knots, they were all symbols of a world Vane had mocked, used to bind him in death to the very soil he had despised. The sound of a car door slamming and the unmistakable bark of DCI Blair's voice announced the end of Hamish's brief solitude. Blair burst into the station, his face glowing with an oily sweat, followed by a silent, weary Jimmy Anderson. Blair took one look at Hamish peeling potatoes and let out a sound like a punctured tire. "Still at the catering, Macbeth? I've just spent 2 hours sweating a confession out of that shepherd, only for his sister to show up with 4 witnesses, who swear he was at a wake in Drim until 3 in the morning. My case is falling apart because this village is a nest of liars and sympathizers." Blair's eyes fell on the leather-bound books on the table. "What are those? More recipe books?" Or have you finally decided to do some filing? Hamish set down the peeler and wiped his hands on a rag. Not exactly, sir. These are Mr. Vane's ledgers. I found them while I was mooching about. It seems the late Laird was a bit of a thief himself. He was stealing from his own company, and he came here to hide the evidence. It's a very modern motive, wouldn't you say? Blair snatched one of the books, his greed momentarily overriding his anger. Ledgers? Fraud? This changes the profile. If he was a thief, then Diane Montgomery has a motive, or his creditors. This isn't a local dispute, it's white-collar crime. Why didn't you bring these to me at the scene, you ginger-haired obstructionist? I only just found them, sir, Hamish lied smoothly, his voice a model of rural simplicity. They were tucked away in a very odd place. But there's something else. Mrs. Curry at the hotel says Vane had a meeting last night with someone who was very angry about those books, someone who knew exactly what was in them. If we can get that person to come to the Stones tonight, I suspect they'll lead us right to the truth. Blair narrowed his eyes, sensing a chance for a dramatic arrest that would look excellent in his year-end report. A meeting? At the scene of the crime? Why would they go back there? Guilt, sir, Hamish said, leaning back and looking as gormless as possible. And a rumour I may have accidentally let slip. I mentioned to the postmistress that the police had missed a secondary set of prints at the Stones, prints that lead to a hidden cache of money Vane had buried near the monolith. Everyone in Lochdu knows that Mrs. Borland's shop is the village's main broadcasting station. By now the killer will be terrified that so one else is going to find the loot. Loot? You told the whole village there's buried money at a crime scene? Blair roared, but the anger was quickly replaced by a predatory gleam. Macbeth, for once in your life, your incompetence might actually serve a purpose. We'll set an ambush. We'll catch them red-handed, digging for the spoils. Exactly, sir, Hamish nodded, though his heart was heavy. He wasn't looking for money, and he knew no one would be digging. He was creating a situation where the real pressure would force the truth to the surface. But he had to ensure that Mary wasn't the one who walked into the trap. He needed to lure out the person who had been truly pulling the strings, the person who had known about Vane's fraud and Mary's heartbreak, and had used both to rid themselves of a partner who had become a liability. Jimmy Anderson caught Hamish's eye and gave a small, perceptive frown. He knew Hamish well enough to know that the buried money story was a complete fabrication, but he remained silent, curious to see where the lanky Highlander was leading them. "We move at dusk," Blair commanded, checking his watch with an air of self-importance. "And Macbeth, you stay in the shadows. I don't want your orange hair acting like a flare and scaring them off. This is a Strathbane operation now." Hamish nodded obediently, returning to his potatoes. As the detectives marched out to coordinate their sting, Hamish felt the cold weight of the investigation settling into its final shape. The hidden motive wasn't just Mary's revenge, it was the cold-blooded opportunism of Diane Montgomery, who had likely followed Van to Lochdu not to save him, but to ensure he never made it back to London to testify. She had used the local girl's grief as a smokescreen, but she hadn't accounted for a policeman who spent more time listening to the wind and the village gossip than he did looking at forensic reports. He needed to get to the hotel before the sun went down. He had to speak to Mary one last time, not as a policeman making an arrest, but as a neighbour offering a way out of the darkness. The trap was set, but the bait was far more dangerous than Blair could ever imagine. As the stew began to bubble on the stove, filling the station with a warmth that felt entirely unearned, Hamish Macbeth looked at Lugs and sighed. The peace of Lochdu was about to be restored, but the cost was going to be high, and he knew that once again he would have to play the fool to catch the fox. The shadows in the village were stretching long and thin as Hamish made his way toward the Lochdu Hotel, the damp air carrying the distant rhythmic shriek of a buzzard circling high above the glen. He could see the lights of the hotel flickering through the mist, a beacon of false warmth in a landscape that had become cold with suspicion. To anyone watching, Hamish looked like he was merely out for an evening stroll, a tall, unkempt figure in a salt-stained uniform, but his mind was clicking through the final details of a very dangerous game. He had planted the seed of the buried loot with Mrs. Borland, and in a village like Lochdu, a rumour like that travelled faster than a forest fire. By now the killer would be feeling the walls of the glen closing in, wondering if Julian Vane had truly hidden a final insurance policy in the peat. Inside the hotel, the atmosphere was as thick as a Highland porridge. Hamish bypassed the lobby, where Blair's men were still making a show of taking statements, and slipped into the laundry room. It was a humid, white-tiled cavern filled with the hiss of steam and the scent of starch. Mary was there, her small frame almost lost behind a mountain of linen. She was folding sheets with a mechanical, desperate speed, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. When she saw Hamish, she didn't scream or run, she simply stopped, her hands frozen on a white tablecloth, and looked at him with the weary resignation of someone who had been waiting for the blow to fall. "He's going to arrest Archie, Mary," Hamish said softly, leaning against the doorframe while Lugg sat quietly at his side. "And if not Archie, then Peter. DCI Blair is a man who needs a culprit, and he doesn't much care if the shoe fits as long as he can buckle it." Mary's lip trembled. "It was an accident, Hamish. He fell. I only wanted to shame him. I wanted him to look as small as he made me feel. I didn't think he'd never wake up." "I know," Hamish replied. His voice a low, comforting burr. "But there's someone else who isn't so innocent. Someone who's been watching you, Mary. Someone who knew you were going to that ridge last night and let it happen because it suited their own dark purposes. Diane Montgomery didn't come here for the scenery. She came to make sure Julian never told the police in London about their shared accounts. She's the one who's been whispering in the background, hoping the blame would settle on a local girl's broken heart." Mary looked up, a flicker of horror in her eyes. "She saw me. Last night, when I came back. She was standing in the corridor. She didn't say a word, she just smiled. A cold, terrible smile." "She's coming to the Standing Stones tonight," Hamish said, stepping closer. "She thinks there's money buried there, and she's greedy enough to risk it. I need you to do exactly as I say. Stay here, don't go near the ridge. I'm going to make sure the right person takes the credit for this and the right person takes the fall." Leaving Mary trembling in the steam, Hamish headed back out into the gathering dark. He could see Blair and Anderson preparing their ambush near the police cruisers. Blair was checked his service weapon with a flourish that made Hamish wince, while Anderson looked like he would much rather be at home with a glass of whiskey. The DCI was in a state of high excitement, convinced that a criminal mastermind was about to lead him to a treasure trove. "Positions, Macbeth," Blair hissed as Hamish approached. "We're going up the back way. We'll surround the stones. If anyone moves toward the centre, we wait until they start digging, then we pounce. I want them caught with the dirt on their hands." Hamish nodded, falling into line with the silent obedience Blair expected. As they climbed the ridge once more, the wind picked up, moaning through the heather like a lost soul. The mist had returned in force, swirling around the ancient monoliths and turning the hilltop into a fractured, ghostly world. They took up positions in the deep shadows of a gorse thicket, 50 yards from the circle of stones. Blair was crouched low, his breathing heavy and audible, his eyes fixed on the silhouette of the tallest stone where Julian Vane's body had recently been removed. The silence of the moors absolute, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the gorse. Then a new sound emerged, the soft, crunching tread of expensive leather shoes on the gravelly path. A figure appeared through the mist, tall and slender, wrapped in a shimmering silver raincoat that caught the faint moonlight. It was Diane Montgomery. She moved with a cautious, predatory grace, her head turning from side to side as she approached the center of the stone circle. She wasn't carrying a shovel, she was carrying a heavy designer handbag and a look of intense, focused avarice. She stopped at the base of the central stone, the very spot where Julian's shattered sunglasses had been found. He knelt in the mud, her silver coat staining dark, and began to feel around the base of the rock with her gloved hands. She was whispering to herself, a frantic, hushed stream of words that the wind carried toward the thicket. "Where is it, Julian? You greedy pig! I know you kept a cash stash. Where is it?" Blair's hand tightened on his flashlight. He was vibrating with the need to jump out, but Hamish reached out a long, steady hand and gripped the DCI's arm. "Wait, sir," Hamish whispered, his voice as thin as the mist. "Let her find what she thinks is there. We need the intent. We need her to show us exactly why she's here." Diane began to claw at the peat, her composure cracking as the cold and the wet took hold. She looked up at the stones, her face a mask of bitter hatred. "You died for nothing, you fool, but I'm taking what's mine. I'm not going to jail for your mistakes." It was exactly the admission Hamish needed, and exactly the theatrical moment Blair lived for. The DCI didn't wait for another word. He stood up, clicked on his high-powered flashlight, and flooded the stone circle with a blinding white light. "Diane Montgomery, police! Don't move a muscle or I'll have you in irons before you can blink," the woman screamed, a high, piercing sound that was swallowed by the Highland wind. She scrambled to her feet, her silver coat covered in filth, looking like a trapped animal in the glare of the light. The trap was sprung, the fox was cornered, and the peace of El Octu was about to be settled in the most public way possible. Diane Montgomery did not surrender with the graceful resignation of the heroines in the novels she likely read. She reacted with the frantic, jagged energy of a woman whose carefully constructed world had just imploded. In the harsh, clinical glare of Blair's spotlight, her face appeared haggard, the makeup smearing into the mud on her cheeks, turning her into something ghastly and wild. For a heartbeat, she stared into the blinding light, her chest heaving. Then she spun around, looking for an exit through the ancient monoliths that stood like silent, judgmental sentinels. "Stay right where you are," Blair bellowed, his voice booming with the misplaced authority of a man who believed he had just cracked the crime of the century. He began to stomp forward, his boots squelching loudly in the mire. "We heard every word, Diane. The fraud, the shared accounts, the greed. You didn't just come here to find the money, you came to finish what you started. You don't understand," Diane shrieked, her voice cracking as she backed away, her heels sinking deep into the peat. "Julian was the one. He was the monster. I was just trying to survive him. He was going to ruin me." Hamish stood back, his long frame partially obscured by the shadow of a stone, watching the scene with a weary, observant eye. Luggs gave a low, rumbling growl, his ears flattened against his head. Hamish saw what Blair was too excited to notice. Diane wasn't just cornered, she was desperate enough to be dangerous. As she retreated, her hand dipped into the pocket of her silver raincoat, emerging with a small, snub-nosed revolver that gleamed dully in the periphery of the flashlight's beam. "Get back!" she screamed, pointing the weapon toward Blair. "I'm not going back to London in a van. I'm not going to rot in a cell because Julian was too stupid to stay alive." Blair froze, his red face instantly draining of color, replaced by a pasty, sickly grey. The flashlight in his hand wavered, the beam dancing erratically across the heather. Now, Mrs. Montgomery," he stammered, his bravado vanishing like mist in a gale. "Let's not do anything rash. There's no need for that. We can talk about this at the station." "There's nothing to talk about," Diane cried, her eyes darting toward the darkness of the glen. She began to edge sideways, the gun still fixed on Blair, her breath hitching in ragged sobs. Hamish moved then, but not with the lumbering haste of the Strathbane police. He moved with the quiet, predatory speed he usually reserved for poaching a salmon under the nose of a water bailiff. He slipped behind the central monolith, the cold stone pressing against his back, and waited for the precise moment when her shadow crossed the line of the rock. As Diane scrambled past, her attention entirely focused on the trembling Blair, Hamish stepped out. He didn't use a weapon, he used the sheer, surprising strength of a man who spent his days walking the hills and his nights hauling peat. He grabbed her wrist, twisting it with a sharp, firm pressure that sent the revolver clattering into the heather. Before she could scream, he had her arms pinned behind her back, his movements as economical and effective as the knots on Julian Vane's body. Diane collapsed into a heap of silver fabric and bitter tears. The fight drained out of her as the Highland cold finally seemed to settle into her bones. "It's over, Diane," Hamish said, his voice a low, steady calm that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the moment. "The ledgers are at the station, and Mary has told me everything. You didn't kill him with your hands, but you let him die so you could go through his pockets. In Loch-Dew we call that a dirty business." Blair found his voice then, though it was an octave higher than usual. He rushed forward, snatching the handcuffs from his belt and roughly securing Diane's wrists. "I've got her, Macbeth. Get back. I'll take it from here." He stood over the sobbing woman, his chest swelling as he regained his swagger. "A brilliant capture, Anderson, did you see that? I led her right into the admission, then neutralized the threat. It'll be on the front page of the Strathbane Gazette by morning." Jimmy Anderson, who had seen exactly who had actually neutralized the threat, merely sighed and began to retrieve the fallen revolver with a gloved hand. He looked at Hamish, who was once again leaning against a stone, looking as if he were contemplating nothing more significant than the price of wool. "Nice work, Hamish," Anderson muttered under his breath, as Blair began to bark orders into his radio, demanding an immediate transport and a forensic team to secure the loot Diane had been searching for. "I was just standing in the way, Jimmy," Hamish replied, his eyes hooded. "The stones did most of the work. They have a way of catching people who don't belong here." As the constables arrived to lead a bedraggled Diane Montgomery down the hill, Blair turned to Hamish, his face once again flushed with triumph. "You see, Macbeth, this is how it's done. Logic, pressure, and a firm hand. We've got the fraud motive, we've got the partner in crime, and we've got a woman who was ready to shoot a senior officer to protect her spoils. I'll be writing this up as a masterclass in tactical investigation." Hamish nodded vaguely, watching the flashing lights move away through the trees. He knew that Blair would never mention Mary or the laundry girl's involvement. To Blair, a business partner with a gun was a much more prestigious catch than a broken-hearted girl who had accidentally caused a fall. By tomorrow, Archie McLean would be released with a gruff apology, Diane would be processed into the legal system, and the death of a Laird would be another trophy in Blair's cabinet. Hamish felt the cold rain beginning to seep through his uniform again. He thought of Mary, who was likely still waiting in the steam of the laundry, and of Peter, who had tried so hard to protect her. The truth was messy, human, and tragic, but in the official report, it would be cleaned up into a neat story of greed and police brilliance. "I'll be getting lugs home then, sir," Hamish said, touching his cap. "Since you've got everything so well in hand, I suspect there's a pot of stew at the station that's been on far too long." "Yes, go on." Blair waved him away. "And try to stay out of trouble, Macbeth. Some of us have a lot of paperwork to do to ensure justice is served." Hamish turned and began the long walk down the ridge, his silhouette disappearing into the mist. Justice, he thought, was a strange word. In Lochdu, it usually meant making sure the innocent could sleep at night, even if it meant letting the guilty take the credit for a lie. As he reached the village, the lights of the hotel were dimmed, and the only sound was the wind and the soft, steady trot of lugs by his side. The confrontation was over, but the quiet return to the lazy peace of the Highlands was what Hamish craved most of all. By the time the early morning light began to bleed through the grey ceiling of the Highlands, the police station in Lochdu was a frantic hub of activity, though Hamish Macbeth was doing his level best to remain at the periphery of the storm. DCI Blair was in the front office, his voice booming through the thin walls as he dictated a preliminary report to a weary-looking clerk from Strathbane. The smell of victory, which in Blair's case was a mixture of cheap cologne and self-importance, seemed to permeate the very floorboards. He was painting a picture of a high-stakes sting operation, a tactical masterpiece where he had outmaneuvered a desperate London criminal in the heart of a Sutherland gale. Hamish sat in the kitchen, carefully nursing a cracked mug of tea. He had spent the last hour meticulously cleaning his boots, removing every trace of the peat and heather from the ridge. Jimmy Anderson leaned against the doorframe, watching Hamish with a knowing, cynical glint in his eyes. Anderson knew that the gun had been recovered by Hamish's quick thinking, and that the buried loot was a phantom born of village gossip, but he also knew the price of speaking the truth in the presence of a man like Blair. "He's going to take the whole cake, Hamish," Anderson whispered, nodding toward the front office. "The capture, the recovery of the ledgers, the dismantling of the fraud ring. He's already mentioned to the super that he expects a formal commendation. You'll be lucky if you get a mention in the footnotes as the man who provided the tea." Hamish took a slow, thoughtful sip of his tea. "That's exactly how I like it, Jimmy. A commendation leads to a promotion, and a promotion leads to a desk in Inverness, or God forbid Glasgow. I'm quite fond of my feet being in the heather and my back being against a Lochdu stove." If Blair wants to be the hero of the hour, who am I to stand in the way of a man and his vanity? Just then the door swung open and Blair marched in, looking like a pouter pigeon in a cheap suit. He slammed a stack of papers down on the table, narrowly missing Hamish's tea. "Right, Macbeth, I've finished the primary. I've noted that you were present for the arrest in a supporting capacity. I've also noted that the local intelligence, meaning your rambling stories about buried money, was instrumental in flushing out the suspect, even if the information itself was factually garbage." Blair leaned in, his face inches from Hamish's. "Now, I need you to sign off on the property seizure for those ledgers. I've stated I found them during a secondary sweep of the suspect's last known location. It cares for a cleaner narrative. No need to mention bread boxes or village laundries. Do we understand each other?" Hamish looked up, his expression one of perfect, vacuous compliance. "Oh, absolutely, sir. My memory for these things is terrible anyway. If you say you found them during a professional sweep, then that's surely how it happened. I was likely just confused by the mist. It does strange things to a man's perception, the Highland mist." Blair grunted, satisfied. "Good. At least you know your place. We're taking Montgomery back to Strathbane now. The fiscal is already salivating over the fraud charges. As for that shepherd, McLean, tell him he's lucky I'm a merciful man. If I hadn't caught the real shark, I'd have had him for breakfast." As Blair and his team began to load their gear into the waiting cruisers, Hamish walked to the window. He watched the convoy pull away, the blue lights finally extinguished, leaving the village in a blessed, ringing silence. He knew that, by the time Blair reached the city, the story would have grown even further. The death of a Laird would be a career-making arrest for the DCI, and in return, the quiet tragedy of Mary and the accidental fall at the stones would be buried under layers of legal jargon and financial forensics. Hamish felt a soft nudge at his knee. Luggs was looking up at him, his tail wagging slowly. The dog knew, as Hamish did, that the village was safe again. Archie was back with his sheep. Peter was likely comforting Ma. Fly in the quiet of the woods, and the outsiders had been purged from the landscape like a fever. Hamish picked up the pen and signed the papers Blair had left behind, his signature a messy, unremarkable scrawl. He was signing away his claim to the glory, and in doing so, he was buying another year of peace in the only place he ever wanted to be. He walked out onto the step, the air feeling clean and sharp after the departure of the Strathbane police. The red Ferrari was still parked in front of the hotel, a garish, silent monument to a man who had tried to own the hills and failed. Tomorrow, someone would come to tow it away, and soon after, the McRae estate would be sold again, hopefully to someone with a bit more respect for the standing stones and a bit less interest in moving the scenery. "Well, Luggs," Hamish said, stretching his long arms toward the grey sky. "I believe there's a bit of bacon left in the larder, and I haven't seen a salmon rise in the loch for 3 days. It's high time we got back to our real work." He stepped back inside and closed the door, the click of the lock signalling the end of the investigation. The credit had shifted, the paperwork was settled, and the lazy policeman of Loch Dhu was once again exactly where he wanted to be, overlooked, underestimated, and entirely at home. The following morning, the sun finally made a tentative appearance, burning through the last of the Highland mist and turning the waters of the loch into a sheet of hamir. Silver. The frantic energy of the previous day had evaporated along with the fog. DCI Blair was safely back in Strathbane, likely already practicing his humble yet heroic face for the local news cameras, and the village of Loch Dhu had settled back into its ancient rhythmic heartbeat. For the locals, the death of a Laird was already becoming a story to be told over pints at the bar, a cautionary tale about the perils of arrogance and the weight of the old stones. Hamish Macbeth stood at the edge of the pier, his old fishing rod in hand. He wasn't officially on duty, though in a village like this he was never truly off it. He watched as a tow truck from Inverness finally winched Julian Vane's red Ferrari onto its bed. The car looked absurdly out of place against the rugged backdrop of the mountains, a shiny, broken toy being removed from a giant's garden. As the truck pulled away, Hamish felt a sense of profound relief. The Sassenach intrusion was over, and the scars it had left on the community would eventually be covered by the heather. He felt a presence beside him, and turned to see Priscilla Halberton Smythe. She looked refreshed, her green tweed coat perfectly suited to the morning air. "I see the circus has left town, Hamish," she said, her eyes following the tow truck as it disappeared around the bend. "Father told me Blair is claiming he personally wrestled a loaded gun from a dangerous assassin. I assume the truth is a little more ginger-haired." Hamish gave a modest shrug, his gaze fixed on a ripple in the water. "The DCI has a very vivid imagination, Priscilla. It's a useful trait for a man in his position. It keeps the higher-ups happy and the paperwork moving. I'm just glad it's settled." "And what about Mary?" Priscilla asked softly. "I saw her at the hotel this morning. She looked different, quieter, but perhaps at peace." "Mary is going to stay with her aunt in Skibo for a few months," Hamish replied. "A change of air, as they say. The fiscal in Strathbane is so focused on Diane Montgomery's fraud and the attempted shooting of a senior officer that they've quite lost interest in the local colour of the case. Peter is going with her. I think they'll find a way to start over." Priscilla looked at him for a long moment, a faint, knowing smile on her lips. "You're a very clever man, Hamish Macbeth, and a very kind one. Even if you do spend half your life pretending to be a useless layabout just so you don't have to wear a tie in Inverness." "I don't know what you mean," Hamish said with a wink. "I'm just a simple village bobby who got lucky with a rumour. Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe there's a very large trout with my name on it somewhere near those reeds." As Priscilla walked back toward the hotel, Hamish whistled for lugs and began the short walk back to the police station. The air was sweet with the smell of wet earth and pine, and for the first time in a week, his stomach wasn't tied in knots over the fate of his neighbours. He reached the station, kicked the mud off his boots, and went inside to the kitchen. He set a fresh pot of coffee on the stove and sliced a thick piece of crusty bread, topping it with a generous slab of salt-crusted butter. The lazy routine he cherished was his once again. He sat in his favourite chair, the one with the sagging spring that fit his frame perfectly, and watched the steam rise from his mug. In a drawer in the front office lay the official report, signed and sealed, crediting DCI Blair with the most brilliant arrest of the year. In a few days a commendation would arrive from the chief constable, and Blair would be insufferable for a month. But here, in the quiet of the morning, Hamish was the only one who knew the full truth of the oats, the twine, and the girl who had been pushed too far. He was the only one who knew that the Standing Stones had claimed a soul not out of malice, but as a response to a lack of respect. He took a long, satisfying sip of his coffee and leaned back, closing his eyes. The mountains were still there, the loch was full of fish, and the telephone was, for once, blessedly silent. PC Hamish Macbeth was still in Loch Dhu. He was still a humble constable, and as far as the rest of the world was concerned, he was exactly as lazy as they suspected. It was, he decided, a very successful investigation indeed.